So we've been to South Thailand, we've looked at an ethnography based on research in Central Thailand. The South Thailand one was studying an aspect of Islam. Buddhist nuns in Central Thailand, studying Islamic girls' schools in India. We've just been to Kuala Lumpur, to the community of brickfields near the train station, and now we are going to have a look at a monograph which is recently published, 2017 I believe, and it's race, religion and the Indian Muslim predicament in Singapore. And it's done by, this is written by a German scholar, Thorsten, I can't pronounce his surname because it's German, I have to apologise for that, and he is an anthropologist whose work I greatly appreciate. And so what we're going to do is we're going to again we're going to be going to the parts of this monograph where he describes his fieldwork and the research methods that he used to collect the data that he would need in order to answer his research question. Yeah, so what we're going to do is just go through, and we'll go into full screen now, and we'll just together have a look at what is going on here. So he asks the question, and this is one of the ways that he is stating his research question. What does it mean to be an Indian Muslim in a country where Muslim is synonymous with being Malay, and then not the other way around? So he mentions having talked to Indian, Bangladeshi and Pakistani citizens, and for them the experience with Muslim food at the National University of Singapore canteen. He begins by explaining that this particular monograph was written after he had over 10 years after he had been living and working in Singapore as a PhD student at the National University of Singapore, or NUS. And so he presents some census information about the number of Muslims and the number of Indians in Singapore, not all of these Indians being Muslim, but a significant percentage of them being so. He states, when I arrived in Singapore in 2003 to do my PhD, he had no plans of studying the intersection between race and religion in Singapore. Neither was he planning to study Indian Muslims. My MA degree was in Tamil literature, with a thesis on the 19th century poetry. In Singapore, I was hoping to study Muslim connections between Tamil Nadu and Singapore in the 19th and 20th century through a study of Nagor Narga, and that is a Sufi branch, a number of Sufi shrines in Penang and Malacca in Singapore that are based on a very famous one in South India that were founded in 1832. But when I reached Singapore, it soon became clear that the research I had originally planned could not be carried out. The Singaporean Nagor Narga had been closed for a year for renovations, but it looked pretty abandoned. And furthermore, access to the National Library collections was soon limited as well, due to their shifting to a new building in 2005. So he began speaking to some local contacts about their views about what they understood as Tamil Muslim history in Singapore. and unwittingly chanced upon the issue that would engage my scholarly endeavours for more than a decade. This is an interesting and common story, the way that people go intending to study one thing and finding that they are unable to do that, therefore needing to change their research topic. In many ways, it was not experiences such as those surrounding the NUS food stall, which he mentions earlier, that caught his attention. When I spoke about my interest in Tamil Muslim history in Singapore, he was greeted with a certain amount of consternation. Why would I be interested in such a small community? Intriguingly enough, when I framed my interest differently and began talking about Indian Muslims, everyone seemed to agree that it was indeed an interesting topic for research. Why was it seen as viable to research Indian Muslims and not Tamils, even if the sources, respondents and themes overlapped? The matter became increasingly puzzling when I began reading old newspapers and realised that it was not uncommon to speak of Tamil Muslims in Singapore in the 1980s. I began conducting more interviews and also started participating in activities of various Indian Muslim associations and mosques. One day he received an email from a respondent. He thanked me for providing him the opportunity for discussing matters linking Indian Muslims in Singapore, and added a few observations. Now, let me just find where I am. He had failed to make earlier. The first of those was that Indian Muslims hardly had anything in common apart from being Indian and Muslims, both of which he suggested were political categories rather than sociological. Secondly, he compared Singaporean Indian Muslims to beached whales stranded amidst changes and struggling to maintain a semblance of commonality as a community rich in culture and history. Thirdly, he pointed to the problematic situation of being a minority within a minority that was always bothered by the question of whether to align with Indians or with Malays. This email clarified several issues. Until then, I had been struggling with questions of how to justify studying Tamil Muslims or even the larger Indian Muslim community without falling into essentialist paradigms of a primordial community held together by a similarly primordial identity, especially in the face of frequently voiced observations that Indian Muslims were heterogeneous and disunited. Heterogeneous means diverse. The point that my respondent had made was that Indian Muslims were not a community at all, at least not in a sociological sense. Indian Muslims, such as the larger Indian and Muslim communities, were political communities. That is why Indian Muslims as a term made sense, but Tamil Muslims did not, because Indian was recognized as racial and therefore political unit in Singapore, where Tamil was not, or at least less so. The increasing salience of this term Indian Muslim at the expense of Tamil Muslim since the 1980s pointed to shifts within community politics rather than differences in the compositions of local communities. Inadvertently, but also unavoidably, my focus had shifted from studying the history of a particular ethnically, religiously and linguistically defined Singapore community to the politics of race and religion in Singapore. That it took me almost 15 years to complete the study was, in hindsight, almost similarly unbelievable. when I submitted my original thesis in 2006, many of the political developments beginning in the early 1990s were still in practice. There was little indication of their direction in the past 10 years. These changes became clear. Particularly important development was the transformation of the building of what originally attracted me to Singapore. The local branch of the Narago Dargah, which is a shrine, was transformed into a heritage centre. In a sense, the opening of the remodelled Naraga Indian Muslim Heritage Centre in 2014 concluded not only the transformation of the building, but also establishing Indian Muslim as a quasi-racial community by providing it with a landmark building aimed at defining Indian Muslim culture and history. So, let's just have a look at this. It is very, very common for anthropologists reflecting on their fieldwork, writing up their study in the form of what we call an ethnography, to recount all of the unexpected changes and disappointments and sometimes complete and utter U-turns that you make. You go in having prepared a proposal, you have a research question, you have your aims and objectives, your research question, you've already written out your methodology. You arrive and lo and behold, you find that what you had originally aimed to work on is something that you cannot actually do. And so what you need to do is you need to adapt. You need to change your question, and you almost always need to modify your methods. And so it is very common when you are reading ethnographies to read discussions of not only we've read about the way that people get access, all the things you have to do to get access, and the number of months and years sometimes you have to persist in order for you to get access, but also the way that your methodology changes because of the circumstances, the makeup of the community, the daily rhythm. In addition to this, when we read about people's methodological statements, we often read that topics change during the course of fieldwork. So I hope you've enjoyed that short summary of this very interesting book about Indian Muslims in Singapore, and it's time for us to go on to the next one.